Thank you all for your presence today. A bit awkward. I think I will just stand up for people in the room, but online you see my legs. But yeah, thank you so much for being here. When I organized and sent the invite for the event of today, I received a lot of people coming in the corridor saying how much they are happy that you're in the department, because you used to be here full time after you went to Luxus. So today, Turaj Faran will present about the use of Marx in economic history, which goes well aligned with one of the priority of the seminar series, that is basically to explore the discipline, its roots, its theoretical roots, and also kind of explore together the meaning of theory for economic history as well. So without further ado, I will share the screen and let you present.
Thank you very much, Clara. And it's so good to be back in economic history after, the Babylonian captivity. So, I know it's a short seminar and probably most of the time should be devoted to discussion. So I'm going to be very brief, really. I have a lot of slides, but none of them will take a minute. So we start right now. There are 4 topics that I talk about at different lengths. The number 3 probably is most important for you. I have to start somewhere, and then we'll have some discussion. The first one is relation between Marxism and economic history. And actually, I think there's what Weber called elective affinity between Marxism and economic history for reasons that I'll explore in a second. But as just a rough indicator, I just Googled in Google Scholar Marx and economic history in inverted commas, and you get more than 140,000 hits. And it doesn't have any meaning, as all economic historians know, unless you compare it with something. For Weber, it comes, 80,000, less than 83,000. So you can see that I'm sure that most of economic historians are more Weberian than Marxian, but that's how, elective affinity works. But the reasons for that are 2 reasons I could think of immediately. One is we should remember that, of course, Marx never called his approach Marxism. No sane person would call his approach myselfism. So he used, historical materialism, and historical, of course, already has history in it, the significance of that for Marx. And he is probably one of the first, if not the first, social theorist, meaning that he theorized about the process of change, not philosophizing the way that the Enlightenment people have done, but really theorizing it in a way that social science afterwards is used to. And famously, or he's at least alleged that he saw the economy as the base, as the main thing, as central for mode of production. So in that sense, his interpretation of history privileges economic history over political history, over all sorts of other, cultural history or whatever, which should be good news for economic historians. The second reason is that he also gave a model, a theory for development of capitalism or dynamics of capitalism in his famous work Capital. So he has 2 approaches. One is economy as important for understanding history, and the second one, as far as capitalist mode of production in his vocabulary is concerned, then what is the dynamics of the mode of production that came upon from late 18th century up to now, and expanded all over the world, started from Western and Northern Europe and sort of expanded all over the world. So he wrote this book as a sort of economic model, economic theory. And Marxist classics, in that sense, have a sort of relation with economic history, probably incidental, because to begin with, the discipline of economic history didn't exist, of course. And secondly, because their main preoccupation was, of course, with theory. So they're working on economic theory and developing it. By classics, I mean the first and second generation of Marxists before, the Russian Revolution, before up to 1920s, for instance. So economic theory of capitalist development, they were working for that, an economic model, and they were studying history, and especially economic history. I could mention some of them. My point is that studying history for them was incidental. They were not in that sense economic historians that they want to understand history. Studying history for the first generation of classics was a way to develop their model. So they were more interested in theory than really elucidating what happened in history. But anyway, if we go back, you can find in Karl Marx's book Capital, for instance, his theory of capitalist development, but he has celebrated chapters about economic history, like merchant capital, like, sort of enclosure movement, and these sort of things that are very interesting even today, colonization even in the third volume. Not because they teach us as historians something, but they teach us the approach, the method of how to interpret and the relevance of the concepts that he uses for understanding the group. And of course, Engels wrote it, again, that's a book, The Origins of Family, Private Property and the State, which is based on sort of the most recent anthropological studies at the time that he had access to. And in a sense, he's the founder of, what we call family economics nowadays, What is the relationship between family and the economy and the evolution of family and the sort of changes in the economies. And so he goes back to history and, goes into that. So they could be interesting too for seeing these relations of superstructural things with, economy. Probably the most relevant for economic historian is Lenin's The Development of Capitalism in Russia, which he wrote at the end of 19th century, really. I think Yunus might remember that. I know that I was told that in the 70s, that was on the reading list in this department, So, yeah, but that was a crazy time, I suppose. And there's another one which is worth remembering. Trotsky has a pamphlet which was very political. The Result and Prospect is about the first Russian Revolution of 1905. And in it, he mentions the role of capitalist, the role of state, Tsarist state, for development of capitalism in Russia. And then it's argued, there was actually a paper about that when I say lately, in the last 10 years, that Gershon actually got inspired by that article. And I didn't know that because Eric knows very well. I've read almost everything that Gershon has written, but I've never come across that. Apparently he was told that, then he said, oh, it's just coincidence. But I don't know whether he was inspired by that, but it sort of at least prefigures what Gershon, of course, systematized much later in economic history. And there were other theorists in that second generation, Hilferding, famous amongst them, who wrote Finance Capital, and Luxemburg, whose Accumulation of Capital, which actually his way of seeing it is basically a Keynesian underconsumption demand side. But they were trying to explain the new features of capitalism, capitalist development, and here why we are facing export of capital as opposed to export of goods. And his point, and Lenin's point, for instance, was that that's the essence of imperialism. And Luxemburg's point was that capitalism suffers from underconsumption. The demand is not enough for what it produces. So it has to go to non-capitalist societies and countries. And that's the basis of imperialism and colonialism and imperialism. So we have these things, but as I said, they have a theory of economic change, of capitalist development, but not of pre-capitalist modes, really. Even in their discussion of imperialism is from the point of view of the metropole countries, from the point of Europe and United States. They don't look at it from the point of view of Africa or Asia, their economy. they're basically trying to spot the drivers in the capitalist development in the metropole countries. So there are some economic historiography before the word, avant le mot, as probably you say in French. So there's some economic history, but it's incidental to what they're doing. They're not economic historians. And there has been, in this type of work, because we're talking about uses of Marx, this type of work that, Marxian economists or Marxists, provide a model that can be used for economic history. Of course, there has been subsequent development in Marxian economic theory. For instance, Ernest Mandel wrote about long waves. And in this department, for instance, those who work on long waves were sort of influenced by him, albeit directly, even if not, if not directly, but probably indirectly. Or dependency on world system, if they are really Marxists, which are more Marxism than Marxist. And even sort of non-economic or anti-economic determinism kind of things. For instance, Raymond Williams coined this term of cultural materialism. So he thinks culture is important. And some economic historians now, with the turn to culture and language, have used, for that in historiography, even of economic history. So that in Marx's house, there are many mansions, you could go to all the different strands. So it's not unitary, really. And there is a book here by Ben Fine recently, which actually is a compendium of all the different theoretical topics. Amongst the writers is Daniel Ankerlu, who is a graduate from economic history here, who writes about welfare state in Marxian tradition and his theories of welfare state. So it's interesting. For instance, if you are looking for a model to study welfare state, then Daniel Ankerlu's article would be a good reference point to know. So that's the sort of classic, the early ones. And then if we move to official Marxism and economic history, by official I mean when, after Russian Revolution and then Second World War, when there were a host of socialist camps and communist countries and communist parties and all that. But I'm not going to, tell you just facts here and there. I try to have a sort of conceptual framework, and that's the tension between theory and history among those Marxists. So there are two approaches here, actually, in official Marxism. The first one is sort of course, safeguarding dogmas, or what they take to be the dogmas, the central tenets of Marxism. For instance, the 5 stages of development that Marx mentions for Europe, actually, for Western Europe, for Europe, basically, the primitive commune, and then the slavery and feudalism, and then capitalism and socialism as a sort of dynamics that's, of the modes of production. But when it comes to Asia, and in his correspondence or wherever else, Marx mentioned Asiatic mode of production. This concept now has been discredited by subsequent Marxists with, very, extensive studies, because Marx's information about countries like China, India, Persia was what was available at the time, and now we know much more historically. So he based his conceptualization of Asiatic mode of production, which, hydraulic country societies, because, water was scarce, that's why the state dominated, because the state was managing the water, which was scarce. That has been discredited. But at the time, in the 30s, for instance, there was this conference in Soviet Union. There were actually at least 3 conferences in the Soviet Union that there were scientists there. It's not just that, Stalin wasn't that powerful then, but it's not just, it was just a party decision. It was several congresses of historians and economic historians and economists. And there was a debate between Asian, students and those who stayed Asia and others. Some of those conferences were in Caucasia, in Tbilisi. That's famous one, the first one. And the second one was in Leningrad at the time, in Petersburg before and now. And they decided, no, all countries go through these 5 stages. And after that, the historiography became like that. So you have to call it feudal, you have to call it slavery, mode of production of slaves and all that. And the same is true of China, which is related to this, because Mao Zedong, I think late 1930s, he wrote this essay about China's society, and of course, being a Marxist, he had to talk about the economy and its history. And he said that, you know, in this country, feudalism is sort of shored up by imperialism. So the foreigners came and they consolidated feudalism instead of, you know, bringing capitalism here. That's for whatever reason that we don't have to go to. But that was a strange saying because, you know, imperialism came first, Opium War, 1840, you know, while at least according to Mao himself, there was no slavery in China for 3,000 years. So, and Mao, following that decision of the Soviet historiographers, called it feudalism. So there's a feudalism for 3,000 years that doesn't throw up, so to speak, capitalism out of it and wasted life. So that there was this problem in it. So much of Chinese economic historiography during, you know, up to 1980s, 90s even, was trying to sort of, how do you say, the sort of circle the square. What is wrong here? Because, and they came up with funny concepts and ideas. What I want to say is that if you're safeguarding the dogmas, you are what I think Thomas Kuhn called, you know, problem solving within a paradigm. It's not really economic history in a strict sense. You're not studying economic history. You're trying to safeguard your paradigm. And, you know, that I think Robert Wade wrote this famous article when, you know, World Bank was trying to explain East Asian rise and, you know, growth, miraculous growth in terms of, you know, market forces. And he said the art of paradigm maintenance, if I'm not mistaken, that's the name of that. So that's what I mean, that they are trying to, this first approach is this one. And I have to say, I'm not talking about, you know, party politics, I'm talking about economists. And that's what is done everywhere. You know, if you, there's a parallel tension in theory and history and economic history in the West too. Or let's not call it West, in mainstream economic history. I think it was Sidney Pollard who said that economists come to economic history in search of a body, and historians come in search of a soul. You know, so this duality is very nice, really. Historian wants to make sense of history, so they think economic history. And economists want to say what it really was like. So they want the body. So this duality is really strange, and you see it in the world of historical economics. Up to 2008-10, historical economics, and as Yunus has published in that journal, so he knows the editors, that I think I referred to them somewhere, yeah. And for them, economic history is economics with historical data. And first, they were very cocky about it, that, you know, that's what it is. Actually, it goes back to climatic revolution, because it's not just using regression or whatever, which is just a tool, but using certain theories, which are, you know, mainstream neoclassical economic theories. And they are doing the same thing. I remember late Professor Schoen here, when Kevin O'Rourke was here. He tried to explain, you know, the growth of after First World War, you know, just by, or the 19th century actually, just by market and trade, and the figures actually didn't support him. So Leonard Schoen's comment was, if you remember, Yunus, that you're trying to over-explain what's not there, which was a great, you know, way of, you know, saying that you're worried about your paradigm. You're not worried about the facts and realities of history. You see what I mean? So they're doing that in historical economics too. They want to show that their theories actually stand for theory. Even, you know, sometimes for Neolithic revolution, they use actually the same. I think there's an article about that uses neoclassical economics to explain the desirability of Neolithic revolution. the same assumption of homo economicus and all that. But some of them have changed, actually, especially after the Great Recession, which we are 14, 15 years into it now. They're trying to, in light of history, they're trying to adjust their theories, which is a good thing. And that takes us to the second approach in official Marxists, those countries. So, for instance, some of you might be familiar with Ranke, because there was a book by Bernard and Ranke when I was here that it was on the reading list about an industrialization of European periphery. And he has a very good book, Economy of Foreign Policy, the struggle for hegemony between great powers in Hungary, in Danube Basin, in Danube Valley. And that's, I was reminded of that actually quite by accident, because I was reading the book by Adam Tooze about, Adam Tooze is, all the rage among economic historians now. His work crashed, about the Great Recession. But he had written a book in 2006-07 about Nazi Germany and Second World War and the economic reasons for them losing the war, not just military history or political history or ideology or whatever, which was a very interesting book. I was reading that, I was reminded of that, because it's the same thing, using economic history to understand the great politics, wars, and end of wars, who wins in the war and all that. That's why I was reminded of that. And I'll come back if we have time. And the second one, which is probably more important, especially for you, because if the first one uses economic history for understanding history, even politics, the second one is pure economic history. Some of you might have heard of him. Witold Kula is a Polish economic historian, and he wrote this book about feudalism, feudal system in Poland from 1500 to 1700s, probably. Yeah, I have it here. Actually, Brodel was very impressed by that book, and the reason I've chosen him because it's a good exam scientific study, not just because they're not dogmatic, because it can sort of synthesize or overcome that duality between theory and history, or abstract theories and concrete empirical history. And Brodel here, you can read it, I just say the gist of it. It says that he doesn't take feudalism to be a model or a system. He works out the model for feudal Poland from his study. So feudalism is different from place to place. That's why the model that he works out cannot just be applied to any other country in Europe or Third World or any other period. You have to be careful. This model is valid only for this period in Poland. This is, to my mind, because he uses concepts. He just doesn't repeat facts. He uses concepts like rent, like, share of peasants, like, productivity of land, like whatever. So he uses concepts and produces a model. Models are usually a sort of causal relationship between a few concepts. And he has that. But it's not valid for other places. One might ask, so where is the sort of general theoretical lesson of this book? And I think there is no sort of contradiction between what Brodel says and what he himself says about his book in the introduction. He says, he says this book is important not because it studies Poland, because he was Polish and he knew the archives and all that. It's important because it gives you a method to study societies that the market was very weak. So their economy, the way it worked, was very different. And that's very important because all the, East Asian miracle or whatever is explained, but that people will react to markets. So if you introduce market forces and liberalize markets, African peasants will produce for world market and all that and choose, and somebody says, solve, these simultaneous equations, differential equations to produce what at what price and with what combination to minimize the risk and doing all that. These are the assumptions that we have, and it shows that you have to study economies on their own terms. You have to find out the concepts that are really valid in this context. And it says that the methods of how to study economic life in a country in which the market is weakly developed. And that's really, I benefited from reading that actually when I was working on my thesis, which was about China. So yeah, I think there are good works, like good works in mainstream economics, that actually resolve this thing. I think Gershon Peron is another approach to actually resolve this tension between abstract theories and history by introducing the concept of typology. You don't have a rigid theory that fits all, but you take into account other parameters that change it. Now I take probably another less than 10 minutes, I hope. Now I come to academic Marxism, which is, in the West and mostly English authors really, or some French too. And here again, as I said, the concept that I'm using is the tension, because so far we have seen one tension sort of innate in economic history, the tension between theory and history. And the second tension is actually between economic structure and policy. Economic structure, and every economic historian knows that, how to handle this without becoming eclectic, without becoming arbitrary. And that's the same in Marxism. Marxism is not saying. So we see that. First, mainstream academic Marxists that actually entered into mainstream was a bunch of, they're called British communist historians. And they were, because they were members of Communist Party of Britain in the 30s. Poston actually, Michael Poston, who was, big professor of medieval economy of Europe in Cambridge, he says that in the 30s, all these Marxists rushed into economic history because, economy was the base and all that. But actually, they produced several good historians, amongst them Eric Hobsbawm, who is probably known as at least the most famous historians of 20th century. And he was by training, he was an economic historian, although he used it to understand, the whole history and have a, universal account or general account of history. But he wrote, for instance, a very good article, still readable, The General Crisis of the European Economy in the 17th Century, which is a sort of Marxian interpretation as opposed to sort of Malthusian one, which was very dominant, becoming dominant, especially his teacher, Poston was into that. And the second one, of course, is a staple of Marxist historiography, which Marx alluded to in Capital, that how during the Industrial Revolution, the wages were depressed or even pushed down. So there's a big debate about that at the end ended by saying that, no, it just went up. And he has a review of this debate, and sort of, I think, very balanced one in the 60s. And his famous book about Industrial Revolution and subsequent developments of capitalism, especially in Britain, is his Industry and Empire, which is a very readable book if you're interested in this view of Industrial Revolution and all that. It covers from 1750 up to when he was writing. Now, but the thing is, as I said in the beginning, Marx himself wrote Capital and worked about the dynamics of capitalism, and for obvious reasons, because they were political revolutionaries, most of them, the first generation were concerned with, development, new features in capitalism. They were not really historians, profession or whatever. So the question that Marx never answered, because he himself was a socialist theorist, really, not an academic one. So he had the practical considerations into account. So he never, apart from, he has some notes, but he didn't work out really a theory of pre-capitalist formations, economic formations. And a good example would be here, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the name right, to Saint Croix. And he's a British, Marxist historian. I don't think he was a member of the Communist Party. Actually, the first article there by Raphael Samuel makes it clear that, the Marxist historians were wider than those who were members of the Communist Party. So his book is called The Class Struggle in Ancient Greek World, which, comes up to 7th century, probably 8th century. But actually, it's not, despite the name, it's not a sort of political history. It's very much, for him, very traditional Marxist or orthodox Marxist understanding, the class struggle or the conflict of interest is sort of located into the working of the economy, the slave labor production, and then, peasants there. And it's very meticulous, and it's very conceptually very stimulating book, really, for any, pre-capitalist economy. The way, again, like Kula, the way that he handles those facts, and he uses concepts, and he, for instance, defined classes even. How? Yeah, it's a very novel book. I mentioned that because so far we have taken into, for instance, in this book, it's normal to assume that, if you're writing about the class struggle in ancient Greece, you have to go and understand Greece economy there. And, from the Greece economy, work out the main classes, the sort of middle classes, and see what happened, politics and all that. And he does that. But there is another trend that as I said, about, structure and policy, that we all know. In Marxism, in Marxist historiography, they have the same dichotomy or the same tension. Because famously, the Communist Manifesto opens with the sentence that the history of all societies has been the history of class struggle. But on the other hand, economy determines, so, this tension is there too, like between structural economic forces and policies, where you move from one. And the, transition debate, or actually Brenner debate, is the best place to show that. I'm talking about Brenner debate, although there was a transition debate in the 50s between Sweezy and Dobb. Here it was the same, because Dobb had written something, studies in the development of capitalism in the 40s, even, I think, even before the war, I'm not sure, during the war when it was. And Sweezy criticized that in the early 50s. Sweezy uses a straightforward Smithian model, or what was his name? Perrine, about cities and long distance trade and what happened, with feudalism and gave way to capitalism in Europe, Charlemagne and all that. And Pirene book is called Charlemagne and Muhammad, something like that. So that was the standard account between Dobb, and that was, not very developed. That was primitive, maybe. But in the 70s, the debate was rejoined on two sides. Guibois, actually, and Robert Brenner, both economic historians. I think Guibois is French or Belgian, I'm not sure. And, Guibois, as I've written there, he talks about, this feudal system in Europe declined because of the falling rate of feudal rent. It's very similar to falling rate of profit that Marx has for crisis of capitalism. But he tries to show that actually he's debating against Posson and New Malthusians, basically, and showing that it wasn't the population pressure that made feudalism to go away, or actually population scarcity after the Black Death or whatever. But it was, I said falling feudal rent, but falling rate of feudal rent, I think it was. And Brenner actually talks about peasants' struggle in different parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe. That's why in Eastern Europe, they fight, and the serfdom becomes reinforced, while in Western Europe they move to wage labor. And his critics adopted it as political Marxism, but the label has stuck, political Marxism. And if you're interested in that debate, probably you should read Irfan Habib's critique of Brenner, 2014. Irfan Habib, in his own right, is an economic historian. He's Indian, and he's a Marxist economic historian, and he's very good. And he's criticizing Brenner lately. The first issue of the paper, of the journal, that I'll show you in a second. Now, in this tradition of political Marxism, there's a fairly new book, Charles Post, about the development of American capitalism and the American road to capitalism, 1620 to 1877. And that follows, it focuses on class struggle. So it explains the features of American capitalism, not with, slavery, slavery definitely, but the sort of conflict of interest between classes and the outcome of that conflict. And just somewhere closer to home, Andreas Malm wrote this book in 2016 in, Lucid, which was a PhD program for environmental studies in where I was working. And that he got actually prizes for this book, and he got praise for that. It is a sort of Marxian tradition. His point is to explain the passage from water power in early industrial revolution to steam power, which needed coal, of course, and fossil fuel. And I think traditionally that has been explained by, cutting costs. Factories, instead of being in the rural areas, came to cities, and the factory. But he explains it with the class conflict. So he goes to archives actually, and his point that what happened there was not because economically that was to their benefit to move to coal, but for control of the labor force, that was a better way of doing that. That's the gist of his argument. So that's sort of political Marxism, if you want, in Brenner's tradition, extended to this new, again, between politics and economy. And as I said, about St. Croix, the new thing that the Marxists have done is about the dynamics of pre-capitalist modes of production, which is very important for studying economic history. Chris Wickham says that if we call any pre-capitalist thing feudal, the world has been feudal all over the world for millennia. So it's upon us to really study and understand the dynamics, the rise and fall. Actually, Brodel defines the job of economic historian to explain the rise and fall of an economic system. So he doesn't mean, Wickham, that we should do that. So Perry Anderson has written in his book ages ago, I read it for some other purpose fairly recently. In that book, passages from antiquity to feudalism. He explains how the feudalism in Europe took shape out of two things: Germanic, tribes, and Roman Empire and slavery, fall of slavery and Germanic traditions, tribal, tributary, whatever. And Chris Wickham has a famous article, The Other Transition, which is not transition from feudalism to capitalism, but transition to feudalism. So these are interesting things. And Efra Habib has done the same thing for India in two of his. One is a book, and the other one is a collection of essays about Indian economy. And he is adamant, he wants towards a Marxist perception, towards a Marxist interpretation of Indian economy. So these are the things that one could read if especially you're dealing with the sort of global South economic history. Yeah, that's a journal that Efra is an editor. It's fairly recent. It started in 2014. Or maybe it's not that. Maybe I think it's 2014. Apparently, they're all 2014. And yeah, because I just mentioned third rule, I was thinking I just added that just late last night. Actually, I said maybe with postmodernism and decolonial and all that, maybe I should pick up that thing. Isn't Marx, Eurocentric? Can it be applied to third world like Habib? And there's a very good book by Vivek Chiber. He's an American sociologist, but actually he wrote his PhD thesis about Indian economy and industrialization in India, which is interesting. And he actually argues against decolonization because he has this Indian background. It helps him to be allowed to say these things that some of you cannot say. So he actually argues against historians, this sort of subaltern history studies and this sort of thing. So that's a good thing to take note of if you want to use Marx for global South. And I'm finished. Marxism mainstream economic history. I'm talking about indirect influences of Marxism. I mean, Joseph Schumpeter was really, obviously, he read Hilferding's Finance Capital. They were, contemporary, and Schumpeter knew them very well, social democrats, and he has a lot of his ideas incorporated, but that's osmotic influence probably. And Gershon and Trotsky I already mentioned. Long studies on Mandela I have mentioned. So there is the form of, how do you say, spillover from Marxism to mainstream economic history that has happened. On top of that, Chris Wickham, I'm not going to read that, but Chris Wickham has this book edited called Marxist Historiography in the 21st Century. And he makes this observation, which I think is interesting. He gives several reasons, but one of them, he says, by the end of the Cold War, there is no ideological battle now between Marxist historiographer and bourgeois historiographer. So that allows actually more use of that. And he says that one could draw on Marx the way one could draw on Malthus and Smith and Weber. Actually, there was a conference, that book is the collection of papers in that conference. And he makes a very interesting point. He said, why don't we have such a conference for Weber? We don't need such a conference for Weber, because we all understand, he was a social theorist that we could draw on. It's the same with Marx. We don't need such conferences for Marx now. That's his message, which I thought was interesting to sort of disappoint people at the conference. And that's why I'm not going to read, but because I mentioned Adam Tooze, I know that I haven't read his book Crashed about economic history proper, I mean, he writes faster than I read. So that's the problem. He has written another book about pandemics. But I read recently this book about wages of destruction, which I told you is about Nazi economy during the war as a sort of as an important factor for their defeat. And I'm not going to read it, but he repeats what Marx has said famously in 18th Brumaire, that people, of course, people make history. History is the result of what we do, but we don't do things, in the circumstances, in the conditions that we choose. We do it in the conditions that we face. And these conditions are transmitted from the past to us. That's sort of economic history of things. And Marx actually is not a reductionist, and he recognizes that because he immediately recognizes the perception of people is also very important. The perception of what is happening, what is the problem, and all that. So, and he uses, I mean, not that that makes it much. It actually has been criticized for his 3 books for First World War, or period between the wars, and the third one by Perry Anderson, that were devastating critique a couple of years ago in New Left Review. So it doesn't make him a sort of Marxist, but what I mean is that the method maybe the historical materialist method is becoming sort of normalized in economic history. That he's called the rising economic historian of this generation, and he uses that without any reservation. Really, he quotes them in the introduction. Yeah, I'm done really. It took more than I thought.
So usually how we proceed is that we take a question from the chat online and from the room. I don't know if there's already some people who want to. Eric?
Thank you very much. It's not a question more than a comment, and I would like to respond on that. And I'm speaking from my little corner doing African economic history, where Marxist analysis have never been that popular if you compare to other regions. But you have in African economic history, you have kind of 2 strands. One is those who kind of enter the famous mode of production, talks very theoretical about pre-colonial Africa and even colonial Africa. Quite famous in the 70s, a lot of French scholars, so I will not name them because I can't pronounce their names. Then heavily criticized for, your concepts do not have nothing to do with the real history. Then we have the other strand, which was very common in the 80s and even into the mid 90s, and that is people that clearly know what they're writing about. They know the context, and they use some key terms, Marxist key terms like primitive accumulation, class conflicts, whatever it could be, but in a very eclectic manner, and it's very the kind of describing events in African history in a rather ad hoc way. So there are two kind of extremes in the sense that one that, you know, these are my concepts. So this is how I understand mode of production. This is why pre-colonial Africa went that way. And then the other one, this is what happened in Zimbabwe, 1850 to 1880. And I'm using a Marxian approach to understand this, but it's not really a Marxian approach. It's just, you know, taking this low-hanging fruits in terms of concepts, but never to, you know, provide a solid theoretical explanation for what happened, or conceptual way of understanding what happened. Is this typical? Is African? You don't know. You're not an African historian, but have you seen something similar from other parts of the world?
Yeah, in Africa, I mean, my knowledge about African economic history is just one volume of Austin, was the famous book that everybody reads. That's all my knowledge of African. So I don't know much really about that. I don't know about the other, again, for other regions, you know. But that's the tension I told you about. I suppose the one that you mentioned about theoretical mode of production, this is called articulation of mode of production. Yeah, I've read their theoretical things. I think that was Althuserian, a sort of 70s disease. I think it's died out now. That as I said, these are theoretical debates and use of history just to elaborate their models, not really to understand or to elucidate histories. I don't know. For me, they are dogmatic, basically. They're as interested as, you know, these debates in neoclassical economics about all these. I don't know. You know the examples of neoclassical. We economic historians cannot read those articles. And so, what's the point of this? You know, theoretical points really that talking about. So I don't know really about that. I think for Asia it was less than that. About this articulation of mode of production. I think that was a sort of African thing. I don't remember that. About Latin America and Caribbeans and slavery, there are good books done in Cuba, for instance. Some good books there, but I don't see that, you know, in terms of Marxist tradition they're talking about. I'm not well versed in them really. I'm just aware of some of the books. My age, I can't remember now the name of the authors. I have to look notes. I cannot answer your question. It's a comment.
We have a hand from Tancredi.
Thank you. I have a question.
Sure.
For you. I want to ask you, what do you think about the institutionalist approach that previous group, a mainstream approach? I mean, I'm thinking about the concept of path dependency or of the concept of extractive institution, because I always say the feeling that this kind of approaches are approaches motivated, taken by the Marxist theory, without mentioning the Marxist theory. For example, I mean, they're really, I mean, from my point of view, weak because it's very broad definition of extractive institution. No, it's pretty well known. It's something that, I mean, it's taken by, for example, the Gramscian approach towards the economy and these kind of things, and also the path dependency is, I think it's, I mean, something that is really Marxist in a way. So I want to know, what do you think about this kind of approach that are accepted without mentioning never the Marx and the Marxist theory?
Yeah, I mean, last thing first, because it's easiest. Yeah, dependency and all, as you know, Eric was saying about this. I think these take too much liberty with Marxian concept. They borrow Marxian concept and distort them. You know, for instance, countries become proletarian and bourgeois, which doesn't mean anything in Marxian approach. Or exploitation loses its meaning, really becomes extraction. Robert Bernard actually has written a very good critique of dependency school called New Smithian sort of things. He says it's, I remember I wrote a paper about transition. I think I called it sort of reverse Smithian, because here the market is the culprit. So if the market expands, it's very bad. So that's so simple, you know, for those. That is ruled out. But of course, you're talking about new institutions, not the old. Yeah. A new institutionalism, of course, is a different story. But my understanding, which is, you know, very cursory, is that new institutionalism is actually trying to fix mainstream economics, neoclassical economics, through in light of history. So it brings out history, and there's been a revival of that. Even, you know, Douglas North, which was forgotten for 20 years, has made a comeback, and have people refer to it. Because, for instance, path dependency. Path dependency is a concept to explain why it wasn't efficient. You know, it was supposed to be efficient. It's not. Oh, it must be path dependency. You see what that works and all these things. So they're trying to resolve, and that's how science works. Actually, I don't know if you've read Lacatouche's work. You know, about, I forget the name of his. Well, you know, philosophy of science, and he reconciles Popper and Kuhn actually. And his point is that what scientists do is that they work within their paradigm, and if they face anomalies, they try to resolve them by, you know, auxiliary assumptions. So I think new institutionalism is different from all this. It's a sort of auxiliary assumptions when it comes to anomalies in history. And according to Lacatouche, the weight of this anomaly sometimes grows so hard that the paradigm will collapse. So maybe something good will come out of that. We'll see.
There is a question in the chat, and I have a following up question to Tancredi. The fact that it's being maybe building from potentially ideas that would be Marxist without explicitly it, even though if it's within the neoclassical framework, could also be a way to kind of contradict what Wixom said about it not being ideological. Yeah. And in that sense, I would be curious to hear from your experience in the various departments and in academia. Do you think, I mean, what do you make of this idea of ideological or not?
I think actually, Wixom is right when it comes to medieval historiography. Because, you know, there is not really that ideology attached to it the way it was, that it was class struggle, you know, capitalism was born out of blood and sweat and tears or something. That's not there now. So people are cooler about that. But you're right about, if you're talking about economics, it's very ideological. It's the most ideological, you know, discipline, definitely. So I don't think that holds really for that. There are other reasons. There are institutional reasons, because, you know, there's so much invested in, you know, neoclassical economics, mainstream economics, all these departments and all these, you know, students and degrees that work in here and there. You know, it's not very easy to reverse that. But what happened with the recession 2008, I remember, Jonas knows this better, but Assar Lindbeck said something very strange after that. They asked him what happened. And he said that, oh, economics is very good at predicting boom, but it's not good at predicting bust. What do you tell a meteorologist who just predicts, you know, sunny weather, but they cannot predict rain, you know? It's not that they're 50% right. They cannot really predict weather. That's it. You know, so after that, I think Soros is funding this Institute for New Economics to work out a new paradigm. I think, what was this? Stiglitz wrote this famous article, you know, that the new paradigm is needed for economics. So, but this still lingers on. It's trying to go on. So, yeah.
Just to give the voice to the people in the chat, and also say that if people want to go, in theory, time is up, but I think many people actually want to continue the conversation, but feel free to do both options. So from the chat, there is a following up to this by Dominic, who says that the new institutional economic on that regard, that Douglas North was an ex-Marxist who described himself very late in his career as a Marxist of the right. So that was a kind of contribution from the chat. And there was a question by John Clegg, and after we'll take Sasha's questions, and maybe we can do both to kind of accelerate a little bit. So John Clegg, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself. I can also read the question.
I'm sorry, I think I may have a bad connection, so you can't hear me.
I cannot hear you.
Okay, then forget about it.
I'll read it. I'm sorry. The question is, you did mention Piketty's work and his sometimes you didn't mention Piketty work and his sometimes ambiguous relation to Marxist theory of capital, rate of profit, etc. It seems to me that Toz in history may be doing something similar to Piketty in economic in his non-dogmatic openness to Marxist theory.
Yeah, I agree. But I mean, Piketty does not identify himself as a Marxist, definitely, and he's not. Yeah, I agree with what he says about Toz.
Maybe Sasha, you can.
Yeah, well, it's more of a comment, perhaps, on your point and also the Piketty point, because I think Acemoglu and Autor criticized Piketty and Milanovic as well for like their Marxist approach to history and like these kind of ground forces. But well, more recently, I've been thinking also about the Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson approach, like you were saying, this new institutional economics, especially from them as being quite like Marxist in different ways. I mean, on one, McCloskey has pointed this out now that the economic history they are using in 2001 at least is taken from us. And they do reference it, not perhaps in the theoretical realm, but in terms of the evidence for how things developed and how they explain institutional change. And also, again, then, yeah, this kind of structural forces being more important than anything else. And the student of mine actually in the institutions course now just pointed this out also, that he comes from political science and was reading the HAR 2001 paper on institutions as the fundamental cause of growth and saying it reads like a reverse historical materialism in this explanation, that economic forces then influence the institutions, and this is all that matters, really, the distribution of resources between different classes, like in the elites trying to control this. I think it's probably actually something very interesting to look at from a history of thought perspective that hasn't been done much. And I think one problem is really that the authors are not very explicit now in terms of what is their influence, what is their actual methodological points, and what is their framework. Because I mean, even Acemoglu, I feel there's like two of him in one way. There's the one talking about institutions, perhaps inspired by these kind of structuralist things, and Marxism, and then you have the one talking about skill premiums and so on, just being very straightforward neoclassical in some. I don't know, I cannot combine these two in my head yet, if this is related or if it just takes different approaches to different kind of topics.
I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your participation. It was a very stimulating discussion. We can give another round of applause.